This morning's ancient witness, John 11, verses 1 through 7, 17 through 44. There was a certain man named Lazarus who was sick. He and his sisters, Mary and Martha, were from the village of Bethany. Mary was the one who had anointed the feet of Jesus with perfume and dried his feet with her hair. And it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. The sisters sent this message to Jesus: "Rabbi, the one you love is sick." When Jesus heard this, he said, "This sickness will not end in death. It is happening for God's glory, so that God may be glorified because of it." Jesus loved these three very much. Yet even after hearing that Lazarus was sick, he remained where he was staying for 2 more days. Finally, he said to the disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." When Jesus arrived in Bethany, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Since Bethany was only 2 miles from Jerusalem, many people had come out to console Martha and Mary about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, while Mary stayed at home with the mourners. When she got to Jesus, Martha said, "If you had been here, my brother would never have died. Yet even now I am sure that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus assured her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha replied, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." To that Jesus said, "I am the resurrection, and I am life. Those who believe in me will live, even if they die. And those who are alive and believe in me will never die." "Do you believe this?" Martha replied, "Yes, I have come to believe that you are the Messiah, the begotten of God, the one who is coming back into the world." After saying this, Martha went back and called her sister Mary and whispered, "The teacher is here, asking for you." Well, as soon as Mary heard this, she got up and went to him. Jesus hadn't gotten to the village yet, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. Those who were consoling Mary got up quickly and followed her, thinking she was going to the tomb to mourn. When Mary got to Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "If you had been here, my brother would never have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and in other mourners as well, he was greatly disturbed in spirit, moved by the deepest of emotions. He said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said, "Come and see." And Jesus wept. The people began to remark, "See how much he loved him." Others said, "He made the blind person see. Why couldn't he have done something to prevent this man Lazarus from dying?" Jesus again was greatly disturbed. They approached the tomb, which was a cave with a stone in front of it. Jesus then directed them, "Take away the stone." Martha said, "Rabbi, it's been 4 days now. By this time there will be a stench." Jesus replied, "Didn't I assure you that if you took the stone away, didn't I assure you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" So they took the stone away. Jesus raised his eyes to the heavens and said, "Abba, thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd, so that they might believe that you sent me." Then Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out of the tomb, still bound, head and foot, with linen strips, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus told the community gathered, "Unbind him and let him go free." This goes on. Today's modern witness, Signs of Life, by Brittany Deininger. The tulips are rising from the ground. As if suddenly heard their name, they suddenly walked toward the sound of winter's stone rolling away. One by one, their buds loosen and blush crimson, fuchsia, and boysenberry. For the first time, their unwrapped faces see and are seen. I cut one of each color and bring their green-stemmed mouths to the cup of water. Arranged on the windowsill, they bow respectively to a passerby who are also coming out of their tombs. After resurrection comes the unbinding, the learning of what it means to be free.
Thank you, Beth. I'll have to remember to give you the award for the longest reading possible. But you do it so well, let me say that. Okay. And it was shortened a little bit. Okay. Nadia Bowles-Weber, in one of her books, summarized Christianity in this way. She said, quote, "The Christian faith, while wildly misrepresented in so much of American culture, is really about death and resurrection. It's about how God continues to reach into the graves we dig for ourselves to pull us out, giving us new life in ways both dramatic and small." Unquote. Well, I agree with that for the most part. The Christian faith is wildly misrepresented these days, masquerading as a quest for individual perfection, one that has evolved into a political movement crusading for Christ. Yet, I don't recall reading about Jesus establishing some kind of empire where everybody has to come and kiss his ring because he's so important. Last I checked, in fact, Jesus rode donkeys and not war horses. But more on that next week. It is unfortunate, then, that Christianity has become twisted into a patriotism gone wrong, and that too many in the halls of power either ignore or prey upon the last and the least, causing so much destruction and death to life. I would like to change that word grave, though, because in my experience, at least on an individual level, it seems more like ditches that we as individuals find ourselves falling into. And God knows I fell into a few ditches in my lifetime. So I am extremely grateful for those folk who were there to help pull me out. So I would prefer ditch as opposed to grave. It is a much softer approach. And stories like the Good Samaritan help us to understand that. That oftentimes when we do fall into a ditch, it takes someone coming along to help us get out. On a community level, though, graves is a very apt term to use. If one were to frame it like this: the Christian faith is fundamentally about life, death, and resurrection. It's about how systems of power, dominance, and privilege press vulnerable and marginalized populations into a grave-bound oppression to which God actively works to pull them out. Time and time again, the stories of the Christian faith show that it is a faith fundamentally about relationships. And Sandy and I were certainly reminded of that at conference last weekend. It turns out that of the 650 ministers and faith leaders that went to the rallies and protests in Minneapolis a few weeks ago, 7 of those were in attendance at conference. The 7 that went stood there on the stage, and they showed a few slides, and each shared a brief story of what they encountered and what they saw, of what spoke to them about how the community responded. And one of the things I remember is that they listed and named all the folks in Minneapolis that had died at the hands of the powers that be. And I must confess that, quite frankly, disturbed me. And I had the realization that those who had been named were, in a sense, buried alive. And while I stood there in that uneasy feeling, I heard a story about sub-freezing weather and church doors that had to be locked and guarded. But I also heard about church kitchens cooking soup 24/7. And I began to picture the smell of that spilling out into the narthex, spilling into the whole church. I saw pictures of candlelight vigils and a picture of protest signs that said, "Go home, Nazi," and "Deportation is kidnapping." And maybe my favorite, "Your mother would be disgusted with what you are doing." So what I also learned was that there was a host of networks created in that community shortly after the George Floyd killing in 2020. And for a time such as this, those networks had been reactivated in order to challenge the deportations occurring there. It turns out that there are tens of thousands of people there who stood up to give rides to people, to stand outside schools in order to protect children and their parents, and even deliver groceries, among other things. It's a story about how a community rose up when life was no longer found to be normal. And cultural anthropologists use a term called liminality to help explain the uncertainty of times like these. Liminality is about those threshold spaces we encounter, or the uncertain territory between two realities. It's like standing underneath the threshold of a door and being neither in one room or another, having come from one place and about to enter another. So behind us is the winter, the long nights, the cold temperatures, time spent in hibernation, and all that that brings. But before us is spring, with its lengthening daylight, warmer weather, and budding vegetation. Signs of life that are emerging. Theologian Richard Rohr likes to say that the liminal space is the place where we are betwixt and between, the familiar and the unknown, and between the now and the not yet to come. In other words, it's a space where we gain some sort of idea of what we will encounter, but not yet know the full extent of all that will be required. And so it's the equivalent of standing on the threshold. One of the themes at work in our story for the day is about standing up. In fact, the Greek word used here for resurrection literally means not just standing up, but standing up again. And in Jesus' time, standing up again wasn't just an abstract religious idea. No, it carried a very real weight to it. Many Jewish folk, not all, but many, believed that God would one day raise the dead as a final act of justice. And so it was a very lively debate about hope for what God intends for the future of creation. And this is what Martha is speaking to when she believes that her brother will rise on the last day. And what's interesting about this exchange, about this back and forth, is that Jesus doesn't tell her she is wrong. In fact, he brings that forward-looking hope crashing into her present circumstance when he says, I am the resurrection, I am life. It's the same language echoed by God in the stories of the Exodus. And in a world where the folks in power ruled by fear and threat of death, to speak of resurrection was to commit to valuing life. Was to say that those systems of oppression that deal in death do not get the last word, and neither does the empire that depends on them. And by the way, this is no ordinary life that Jesus speaks of. You see, when Jesus offers life, he offers life in God's age to come, which is a much more deeper life than simply living and breathing. Lazarus is raised, sure, but only back to mortal life. He will one day die again. The point is to say that life should not be just about survival and making ends meet, but actually participating now in this life with God that is to come, the life breaking into this world. And what other thing I find disturbing is that even though the Christian faith is over 2,000 years old, there are still too many people bound by poverty, bound by incarceration, bound by misogyny, and bound by hatred of the different, and bound by the harmful effects of systems of power, domination, and privilege. New life is possible. And when those who have been dying by the hands of the systems of power and privilege are able to get their life back, they need a community to stand by, kingdom love. And that, my friends, is the heartbeat of this story. Beloveds, death is only final if Jesus says it is. The good news is that Jesus raises Lazarus, and God's community is committed to unbind him. And what God makes alive, it is up to kingdom communities to help unbind. This is not some small miracle, but one that comes along in tangible ways. One could say it is God's work and it is our work. It is the work of justice and the work of repairing the world. I'll close with this. Our modern witness for the day, for a time such as this, for this threshold space, puts it like this. When we make sure our neighbors have the ability to make a home, we unbind. When we work to make the stories of minorities rise to the top, we unbind. When we advocate for work that is purposeful and sustaining, we unbind. When we remind women of their own power and give them access to education, we unbind. When we welcome the stranger and affirm their humanity, we unbind. When we call our elected who represent us in power, over and over again sometimes, those who control who has access to what and what resources that affect the last and the least, we unbind. And when we do, we remember the many people who came along to unbind us. And in the process, learn over and over what it means to be free. Amen.